So we're going to start having a look now again at the features of a typical lumbar vertebra. So again, we're going to be using terms that we've used in the previous sessions: pedicles, lamina, transverse processes, superior and inferior articular processes, carrying the facets, and the spinous process. So I've tried to isolate here the lumbar spine a little bit easier because we can get rid of the ribs far more easier in this image. So we've got here a typical lumbar vertebra, okay, and we know that this is a lumbar vertebra. We don't have the transverse foramina. The transverse process is pierced by that transverse foramina, as we saw in the cervical vertebra. We know it's not a thoracic vertebra because we do not see the demifacets on the side of the body or the transverse processes as we did for the thoracic spine. So we're dealing with a lumbar vertebra here. So let's think about the body. Okay, here's the body of our lumbar vertebra in here. And the body is roughly elliptical in shape. And it's long, with its long axis lying transversely. Okay, so the long axis of the body is transversely orientated. Okay, but an elliptical shape to the body itself. The bodies generally are much larger than those in the cervical and the thoracic region, and are slightly higher anteriorly than posteriorly. The difference in height between the anterior and posterior borders of the body are particularly marked at the fifth lumbar vertebra. So let's have a look at the, get rid of those a moment, and we're going to start looking at the vertebral arch. So let's rotate this around and see if we can see the pedicles. And we can see the pedicles quite nicely here. So again, let's pick up our pen so we can draw. So we've got body here, okay. We've got pedicle here. So this chunk of bone here is the pedicle, arising from the junction of the posterior and lateral sides of the body there. And that's the vertebral foramen there, carrying the spinal cord. Now the pedicles are thick and short. The lamina are broad bands of bone which run backwards and medially. So let's see if we can actually pick up a better view of the lamina. Let's get rid of that a moment. Sorry. Lost. We've lost our lumbar vertebra. This is what happens when you try and take out a single bone and work on a single bone. It's not. Here we go. Coming into focus again there. So we talked about the pedicles. Sorry, let's just bring up my tools again. These are the pedicles, the broad bands of bone. They're quite short in the lumbar vertebra, but what we're looking for now are the lamina, and these arise from the posterior aspect of the pedicles themselves. So let's have a look. Here we go. We're coming into a better view of the. Okay, so we had here the pedicles arising back like that, and now we're into the region of the lamina. Okay, so the lamina are quite broad bands of bone which run backwards and medially. The vertebral foramina is generally triangle in shape in the lumbar spine. We've said that the pedicles arise from the lateral junction of the posterior and lateral borders of the body, but they actually arise from the upper part of the body themselves. So again, that means that the inferior vertebral notches are quite deep. So let's have a look at that in a lateral projection or lateral view. Okay, let's have a look at the position of the pedicles. Here are the pedicles, okay, and those pedicles arise from the upper part of the body. So here's our body, okay, and they're kind of arising from the upper part of the body here, okay, which means that the inferior vertebral notch is much deeper. So the inferior vertebral notch is much, much deeper than the superior intervertebral notch. There it is, there's the superior one. And you can see it's much, much more shallow. And that's simply to do with where the pedicle arises from. It arises from the upper part of the body of the lumbar vertebra. So, let's think of the transverse processes. If we just clear that a moment and we rotate the image, okay, here's the transverse process here, the transverse process. They are thin and they're directed backwards and laterally. The transverse processes of the third lumbar vertebra are the longest, and the transverse processes of the fifth lumbar vertebra are the shortest and the thickest. At the posterior part of the lower border of each transverse process and close to the body of the vertebra is a bony tubercle known as the accessory process. In here, the accessory process. Now the spinous process, okay, here's our spinous process of the lumbar vertebra, is directed backwards and is square or hatchet shaped. Okay, let's just fill in that. That was our accessory process. Okay. Now we've got the superior articular process, and again the superior articular process carrying the superior articular facet, and it will be here because we're looking at the image slightly obliquely. So the articular processes arise from the junctions of the pedicle and the lamina, exactly the same as in the other vertebra. The superior articular facets are concave, while the inferior articular facets are convex. And these facets, these superior articular facets, they're concave and they face backwards and medially. Whereas the inferior articular facets are convex and face forwards and laterally. When the vertebrae are articulated, the inferior articular facets lie between the superior articular facets of the vertebra below. The superior articular process bears a bony tubercle on the posterior surface, and this is known as the mammillary process. So the superior articular process bears a bony tubercle on their posterior surface, known as the mammillary process. So let's just remove those pen so we can rotate it around. So we can see the superior articular processes and the facets pointing backwards and medially. If we turn the body around and we bring the inferior articular processes into play, okay, we can see that those facet surfaces are convex and they point forwards and laterally. And those are the features of a typical lumbar vertebra. Okay, a large body, no articular facets for the rib, so we know it's a lumbar. We know that the pedicles arise from the upper part of the body, and therefore our inferior notch is much deeper compared to the superior notch. If we bring it into its posterior view, we can see the transverse processes are relatively short. We can see the superior articular process carrying a superior articular facet which faces backwards and medially. We've got a short hatchet-shaped spinous process, and the inferior articular processes carry the inferior articular facets which are pointed forwards and laterally. And that is our typical lumbar vertebra.